So of course we'll talk about Kamala in just a moment, assuming she's the nominee, and that is an assumption. Like that's not a done deal at this moment by any means. But I want to spend some time on her. But first, just your recap on what has been, and just on Joe leaving.
Yeah, I think that if you know one thing about Joe Biden over his political career, this is a guy that has always cut deals and made deals on behalf of his family. So I think that what we've seen over the last several weeks was not among the Biden family a question of does he stay in, does he not stay in. I think that it was largely an effort to extract the best deal possible for himself and the family were he to step out. I think there was a lot of discussion and negotiation with big Democratic Party donors, and I anticipate that, you know, as time goes on, after he's left office, we're going to see the family being connected to a variety of deals and opportunities with big Democratic donors. So I think that Joe Biden and the family were taking care of themselves. They realized that when the money started to dry up, that staying in was not an option. So then it was a question of dragging your feet and digging in appearance, in the hopes of getting the best deal possible from donors. And I think they probably secured that.
Yeah, so what's that look like? So Hunter gets a job at wherever?
Yeah, Hunter gets a job wherever. James gets a deal wherever. Joe Biden and his family get some, I don't know that this is the case, but some production deal at Netflix. There are all kinds of things that can be done. Let's remember that a lot of the people that ran his finance committee, Jeffrey Katzenberg and others, have a history of giving deals to political candidates, Democrats, and they certainly have the resources to do so. So I think that's what was going on. And again, this fits the history of Joe Biden, so I don't think it should surprise any of us.
Okay, it's really interesting. And I know we're just talking. We're just made up the Netflix thing. This isn't like news, but it would be something like that. It'd be like, all right, Joe, you leave. Katzenberg or whoever's at Netflix, who's the head of Netflix, whatever his name is, he says, hey, Joe, we'll give your family whatever, a $50 million production deal. You have to make one documentary over the next 10 years or whatever the contract says if you resign right now. That's really how things work in this world?
Yes, absolutely. And I think also, consulting deals. I mean, remember, Joe Biden already has a brother who is at a law firm, doesn't have a law degree, doesn't have a law license, but he was one of the head people at a law firm in South Florida, and it's headed by a large major Democratic donor who's a longtime friend of Joe Biden's. So yeah, there are all kinds of things that can be done, not just in Hollywood, but with law firms, with businesses. Hunter becomes a consultant in international business to some entity. I think that's absolutely what's going on, because from the standpoint of Joe Biden, let's remember his entire political career, he's the planet around which all of these other planets revolve in the family. And there are essentially five people, five mouths to feed that are part of the larger family. And that's always been the case, and I think that remains the case. Maybe you add Jill Biden to that list as well.
Yeah, she becomes a professor at UVA or whatever. Okay, very interesting. Will the Government Accountability Institute be able to find out what these new opportunities are as time goes on? Yeah,
we hope so, and we will absolutely be monitoring those because it's kind of reflexive of how politicians become enriched, and they get enriched by, I would argue, making favorable policy decisions for those who are funding them. So it's very common. Let's remember that Barack Obama, when he left, and his wife got a $60 million book deal from a company that was owned by an international conglomerate that had a lot of interest in more peaceful relations with Iran, and that in fact was the Obama policy. And I would argue that that's not a coincidence. So this sort of thing does happen, and we will absolutely be monitoring it.
All right, Ruka, I don't want to get too much in that. I want to get back to Kamala. But what book company could have a deal, have an interest in what happens with Iran?
One owned by a German conglomerate, which is what the case was. Wow. It's a German conglomerate that owned the Obama's book company. They gave him a $60 million deal. They had widespread commercial interests in Iran and wanted sanctions reduced and a series of other policy actions taken, which were actually positions supported by Barack Obama.
Amazing. Follow the money. No one does that better than Peter Schweizer. All right, just some preliminary thoughts on Kamala Harris. What do we need to know about her?
Yeah, I did a book back in 2020 called Profiles in Corruption. It was sort of a look at the major candidates in 2020. The probably, I would say, the biggest two chapters were on Joe Biden and on Kamala Harris. This came out in early 2020 before either one of them had secured their positions. And Kamala Harris has a massive and long history of, I would argue, very frightening activities as a prosecutor that shows selective favoritism to criminal networks and organizations linked to her political allies, while at the same time covering up and trying to minimize some pretty horrific crimes. In her particular case, all you have to do is look at the early 2000s when she is the district attorney in San Francisco. And San Francisco, under her tenure, is the only major American city that did not prosecute a single case of priest sexual abuse. The only major city. And the reason is quite clear, that the people that helped get her into that position included a collection of law firms and individuals who financed her campaigns, who represented the Catholic Church and Catholic entities in San Francisco. She took over her slot. In fact, she ran for that position in San Francisco against a guy named Terrence Hallinan, who was a liberal but tough-nosed ex-boxer prosecutor. And he was the attorney at the time, and the mayor, of course, was Willie Brown, with whom she had a romantic relationship before. And Terrence Hallinan had been investigating Willie Brown and his allies on a series of corruption cases. These include city officials. These include major financiers to his campaign. Willie Brown didn't like that, so he essentially bankrolled and organized her campaign to knock Terrence Hallinan out of that position. And when she won, she dropped a whole series of cases against guys like Henry Chinchilla and others who were going to be charged or had already been charged by Terrence Hallinan. What they all had in common was they had all financed or were close friends with Willie Brown. Probably the biggest case, though, is the one involving the Catholic Church. Terrence Hallinan had received a 800-page internal document from the diocese in San Francisco, which highlighted a series of abuse cases, of which, unfortunately, we're all too commonly aware of, that had occurred around the country. These 800 pages covered cases in San Francisco, and Hallinan's plan was to prosecute those individuals identified in the report and then take out the names of the victims and release the document to the public. And this is what victims abuse groups wanted to happen. When Kamala Harris came in, not only did she not prosecute anybody involved in these scandals, she actually refused to release the 800-page document, and it has been reported in San Francisco that document disappeared and was never to be found. And the sorts of individuals and entities that were tied up with this priestly abuse scandal included a school in San Francisco, an elite preparatory school called St. Ignatius College, where people like Jerry Brown and the Getty family, who are, of course, big Democratic donors, were intimately involved. So my contention is that Kamala Harris, as a prosecutor, she did the same thing as Attorney General of California, used her position not to protect the vulnerable, but to actually protect the powerful people that put her in political office.
Unbelievable. So you think that was instigated by the law firm of the Catholic Church that didn't want to go through the litigation, or didn't want to go through the whole process, and liked her? What was their motive? It was the law firms that instigated this, and what was their motive?
Yeah, what's interesting, I lay it out in Profiles in Corruption, is that she actually had no history to the connection to the Catholic Church, and the law firms that represented the church were some of the big financiers behind her campaign, even though she had no connections to those law firms. What she did, however, have is a lot of political ambition. She wanted the position, and we recognize that all politicians are that way. So what ended up happening is precisely that. These law firms, some of whom had never given to political candidates before, lined up and financed her campaign. Some of the power elite that were tied to these institutions that ran Catholic charities that were connected to the prep school, people like the Gettys lined up to bankroll her campaign. And, of course, it was Willie Brown who was the one who sort of engineered the whole thing. His campaign staffers who would put him in office as mayor ran her campaign. He sent out fundraising letters. So it was that network. And the end result was that these cases that Hallinan was pursuing, the sex abuse scandal, there was a guy named Ramirez who was a cement contractor. He had used subpar cement to build parking garages and bridges. You can imagine the implications of that. And he knew that he was doing this. Hallinan was going to charge him. Kamala Harris reduced those charges and basically gave him a slap on the wrist. And Ramirez had been a big financier and a big social friend of Willie Brown. So that was her record. I would add when she became California's attorney general, you saw the same pattern. There was, for example, the San Francisco office of the California Attorney General's office wanted charges brought against about half a dozen nutrition companies, arguing that they engaged in false advertising and a series of other activities. And this would have been right up Kamala Harris's alley. These are the kinds of cases she liked to bring. In this case, she did not bring charges. And the troubling reality is that those 6 nutrition companies at the time were represented by a law firm where her new husband, now the first or second husband of the United States, Doug Emhoff, was a partner. So it was a massive conflict of interest. But again, I would argue because of the favorable connections of those that were being accused of these activities, those charges were dropped. And I think this is a very clear, consistent pattern that we see of Kamala Harris when she has been in political power.